go and I'll get it.
Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Rand Flem-Ath. And we're going to talk about his belief, and he's got a book on this too, by the way, that Atlantis is beneath the Antarctic ice. And this is a theory that I've read from time to time before in the past. And I'll be honest with you, being a radio show host for 5 years now, I've interviewed guests that's had thoughts that it was by Bimini and India and Santorini and, under the ice here at the Arctic Circle. And I really find listening to all these theories very, very interesting, because I know from what I've also read, guys, that, Atlantis wasn't the only sunken continent. So if one person is mistaken about what continent is under that ice, as long as he knows there's a continent there, it could be one of the other lost ones. And then that's always interesting information to have. So I'm going to introduce Rand here and give him a chance to tell you what got him started looking for this at the Antarctic ice there. So, Rand, how are you doing today?
Very good. Yeah. How I got started into Atlantis. I'm a librarian by profession, and I was working in the library, and I came across a book about Atlantis, and I was just looking through it, and then there was a map in it, and I said, I'd never seen a map of Atlantis before, so I took a look at that. And then, a week or two later, another book came in and across the counter there. It was called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. It was written by Charles Hapgood. And, it was kind of interesting because it's all about ancient maps and how some of them are far more accurate than they should be. And anyway, I was looking through it, and in it showed a map of Antarctica without the ice. And immediately that picture of Atlantis came back, and I started to I looked at them and I started to compare them, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is 1665 map of Atlantis looks just like this 1970 map of Antarctica without the ice. So that was the thing that got me started, and after I had looked into that, I read the maps of the ancient sea kings, and I discovered that there was maps that showed South America and Antarctica long before Europeans were even capable of mapping continents. So there was a particular map, the Pyrenees map of 1513, and it shows the eastern shore of South America, and then it shows on the bottom the subglacial features of parts of Antarctica. So now that was, that means that what it was like underneath the ice. So that got me thinking, well, what's going on here? So I went back to the maps of the ancient sea kings, and I was looking at that, and I noticed that this Charles Hapgood fellow had also written another book called The Earth-Shifting Crust. So I got a hold of that and looked into it, and then it started to click together to me. I started to see that there was something here that was worthwhile investigating, and I came to the conviction that there was Atlantis had been a real place and had been destroyed by a real event, and was still discoverable. Once I got onto that, then I started to delve into this whole theory of Earth crust displacement, which I probably should just give a little bit of an explanation of that.
Okay.
We all know plate tectonics is the Earth is made up of a series of plates that are very gradually moving in relationship to each other. And this is sort of similar, except that in this case, we're talking about all the plates as a single unit, as the outer shell. if you took a orange peel off an orange and then it reattached it. The orange peel itself is like the crust. And this, what Charles Hapgood proposed was that the Earth's crust periodically is displaced over the interior. And when that happens, there's incredible climatic changes. Because you can be in an area, say, in a temperate area, and end up in a polar zone. Or you can be in a polar zone and end up in a temperate zone. And when I started to look into this, I looked at, because he had estimated this happened about 12,000 years ago. And, of course, the story of Atlantis takes place. The destruction of Atlantis is supposed to have been taken place at 9,600 BC. So when I looked at that time period, we start to see that this is what geologists regard as the end of the Ice Age. Suddenly, everything's North America, which had been under a blanket of ice. There was an ice sheet on the eastern half of North America that is as big as the ice sheet that's on Antarctica today, and there was another ice sheet on the western side, the northwestern side of North America, that is as big as the ice cap that's on Greenland today. So, with all that ice on North America, the ocean levels are lower, much lower, nearly 100 meters lower than they are today. So there was a lot more land around the world. The continental shelf.
That'd be about the time of Noah's flood, wouldn't it?
Pardon?
And wouldn't that be close to the time of Noah's flood as well?
Well, this is the flood. Yeah, we are talking about the flood. And the thing about Noah's flood that's interesting is that the story of Noah's flood presupposes a civilization existing before the flood. Otherwise, you wouldn't be getting the blueprints for making an ark that includes, units of measurements and how to construct it, and hunters and gatherers aren't building these big ships like this. There was a civilization, in the Bible it's corrupt and wicked and is deserving of dying, and only just one man and his family survives. But the point there is that in the story of Noah, there is a civilization before the flood. And this is the thing that we start to find when we look around, because what I did at this point is I then started to look at world mythology. I started to look at the story of the flood. And again and again, throughout the world, in North American native mythology, all the way around the world, in South American native mythology, in Asia, Africa, we find these stories of a civilization that existed before the flood, and most often they refer to it as an island. I can give you some of those stories, but just to get back to where we were beginning here.
Okay.
When I realized that the big ice sheet that on North America was then melting, that looked as if the North American continent had shifted, as well as the whole continent. It's the entire shell that's moving, and the continent just happens to be one of the passengers, if you like, as are the ocean basins. And what happened in North America was suddenly, having been in a polar zone, North America went into a temperate zone, and all those ice sheets, those vast mountains of ice, began to rapidly melt. The remnants are the Great Lakes, and in the process of melting, this is what the worldwide flood was. In addition, of course, as the crust shifted, there was massive earthquakes and floods. All of this is happening at around 9,600 BC, and this is precisely the time that the original account of Plato gives us for the destruction of this island continent of Atlantis. The story itself originates in the works of Plato. Plato wrote two dialogues, Tunisius and Cretius, both of which dealt with Atlantis in part. And in his account, he pinpoints the time as being 9,000 years before his ancestor Solon received the story. And his ancestor Solon lived around 600 BC. So it's 9,600 BC. So without any radiocarbon dating, without any anything to do with science, Plato's account pinpoints the exact time that geologists now say was the end of the Ice Age. Now, in the theory of Earth crust displacement, there really isn't ever an end to ice ages. Ice ages are simply those parts of the crust that are in the polar zone. So right now, there's an ice age in Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada. Prior to this time, before 9,600 BC, the part of the pole that was at the part of the crust that was at the pole was in the Hudson Bay. So with these Earth crust displacements, you get incredible climatic change. The other thing that was happening at this time, and this has happened in the past decade, is something that's really quite remarkable, and that is in a place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
I've heard of that place.
Yes. Well, it is the most astonishing archaeological discovery that we've ever made, as far as I'm concerned. It dates exactly to 9,500 to 9,600 BC. It exactly dates to the time, the very century that Plato says Atlantis is destroyed. And this is the time when the ocean level is rising, massive extinctions in North America, South America, Siberia, the beginnings of agriculture around the world. All these things are happening at the same time. And what we have at the Göbekli Tepe is suddenly, and previously to this, there's just hunters and gatherers going on for thousands of years. And then suddenly and abruptly, we have these 16-ton, 18 feet high limestone pillars being placed in circular formations after having been dragged for a third of a mile up a hill, and put into place as if it was a very simple thing to do. Now, when the current site is being almost completely controlled by the German Archaeological Institute, and they have concluded that to be able to move just one of these, would require at least 500 people. Now, as far as archaeology and anthropology is concerned, there wasn't populations of 500 people at that time. Everybody was living by hunting and gatherings. You might get up to most populations were 30, 40, 50 people. You might get up to 200 or 300. But suddenly we have what's called monumental architecture appearing with nothing before it. And then as the time goes by, they try to build other things, but every successive building project is less sophisticated than the original one. In other words, rather than improving through time, it's declining. It's as if there was knowledge in the past that was suddenly lost, and then it diminished, and people tried to mimic it and weren't capable of doing it. And that's what we're seeing there. And that's exactly what we would expect to see if this was the remnants of an advanced civilization in its last gasps. And this is what I think is happening at the Göbekli Tepe. The survivors of Atlantis had technology that they were still able to use that could carve and move these limestone things with ease, stones with ease, put them together, and then that attracted people. Then they were able to convert the people into following their needs. And then within a 100-mile radius of Göbekli Tepe, there's dozens of early agricultural sites. There's one site that's about 60 miles away that has wheat, barley, pigs, goats, rabbits. All of a sudden, prior to this, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived by hunting and gathering, and then right at this time, as this Göbekli Tepe, what was originally called a temple, appeared, suddenly we have agriculture. And so my thinking on this, and what we put forward in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, is the idea that survivors from Atlantis, in an attempt to reboot agriculture, built these structures, attracted people to begin the process of beginning agriculture again. And eventually agriculture did get going, but the civilization at that time just didn't survive. It went dormant. But agriculture had been reborn, and almost simultaneously, this was happening in South America. It was happening in Central America. It was happening in Thailand and China. It was happening in Ethiopia. It was happening throughout the Middle East. There was massive changes in Japan in terms of suddenly you have a pottery appearing. All of this is happening at the same date that Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. So that's a little bit of a brief introduction to what Atlantis Beneath the Ice is about.
Now, as I understand, you and your wife did this book as a joint project, didn't you?
Yes, we sure did. Yeah, Rose, my wife Rose, is a far better writer than I am, and I do the research and block out the ideas and might even do the draft and everything. But I need a real professional writer to turn it into words that are worth reading, and that's what she brings to the table. And so she certainly is carrying her half on this project. That's for sure.
Yeah, me and my wife have a similar system. Like I do the reading for her and the talking and groups because she's not good at PR, but then she does other things for me like cooking, or not necessarily cooking, but other little things for me that makes up for it. So we kind of cover each other's weaknesses, in other words.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Yep. That's it's been a great partnership, and this has been a long project. We started this, believe it or not, in 1976. We began corresponding with Charles Hapgood in 1977, and corresponded with him for 5 years until his death in 1982. He, in turn, when he was developing the theory of Earth crust displacement, corresponded with and actually met with Albert Einstein. Einstein, in fact, directed much of the research that Hapgood was doing. They met. He had a personal meeting with them. Hapgood was bilingual. He could speak German, and that certainly facilitated the conversations with Einstein. But it was a big deal for him to get Einstein to even consider looking at an idea that was outside of his comfort zone. But Einstein really globbed onto it. He really liked it. He thought he called it fascinating, compelling. He tried to get Hapgood a Guggenheim Foundation. He tried to get Hapgood into the advanced study program at Princeton, all to no avail. You would think that he would carry some weight with people, but they just didn't want to go into this idea for some reason, and I don't know why.
Might have been before its time.
It certainly seems that it was. Anyway, Charles Hapgood was very generous with us. He was very encouraging and encouraged us. We've dedicated this book to him incidentally. He was very good in terms of helping us develop our ideas and encouraging us to just go further. He didn't really. He had a different theory of Atlantis, but he was sympathetic to what we were doing. It was a fun time. It was very encouraging. In the last year that he was alive, we were living in London, England, where I was using the British Museum's reading room, the mecca for librarians around the world, where I could receive books within an hour that would take me months to get in Canada. And I remember sitting on the steps of the British Museum, and Rose came up with a letter which I had sent to Charles, and it came back, sorry, he said, deceased. And I just suddenly felt so alone. I had a friend and a colleague, and then he was gone. And his last letter to me was so interesting. It actually formed the basis of another book I wrote called The Atlantis Blueprint with an English writer, Colin Wilson. But he was he's beginning to get acceptance now, and far more people know of the name Charles Hapgood than did before. And I think as time goes by, it will be recognized that Charles Hapgood was one of the great figures of the 20th century. So that's where we start from. We start from his theories of Earth crust displacement. I went on to apply the theory to the origins of agriculture, and of course I believe that the Atlanteans had a hand in that, but I wanted to publish in a scientific literature, so I wrote an article called The Global Model for the Origins of Agriculture, and I sent it off to a Canadian anthropological journal, and it was accepted immediately and became the lead article, and I was quite astonished. But I know for certain that if I had even whispered the name Atlantis, I would have never got that published. But what I did do was show that his theory of Earth crust displacement is a viable explanation for the sudden, simultaneous, global emergence of agriculture around 9,600 BC. And the fact that humanity had been living for hunting and gathering for probably, if you talk about, estimates now are that modern humans could be up to 200,000 years old. Actual artifacts are probably like 135,000 years ago. But even if you say 100,000 years ago, that's a long time. 90,000 to 100,000 or 120,000 years of just the same thing. We're all living by hunting and gathering. And then suddenly, in this specific century, the century that's been pinpointed in Plato's account, we find agricultural experiments all around the world in some really odd places that you wouldn't have expected and not. And here's a very interesting feature of it. Every domesticated plant that we eat today was originally domesticated at least 1,500 meters above sea level. And that goes back to the fear of the rising ocean. People didn't want to be near the ocean. Well, don't forget that the continental shelf was disappearing. The ice sheets that had been on North America were ferociously melting, and the ocean level was rising. There were still aftershocks from the Earth crust displacement, so there was a lot of tsunamis coming in. Nobody wanted to be near the shoreline. So you suddenly find that people are moving upland and into the highlands. And it's in the highlands that all of our domesticated plants were originally domesticated. And the reason that we know that is that for 30 years, a Russian botanist collected samples, over 50,000 samples of wild plants that were considered to be the ancestors of our domesticated plants. And so he just did it all over the world. And when he looked at the whole thing as a whole, he discovered that everything was above 1,500 meters above sea level.
Didn't Ignatius Donnelly make a similar observation, or no?
I wouldn't be surprised. Ignatius Donnelly had a lot of scholarship. He was quite the character, and he might very well. I've read his book a few times, but I don't recall that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was.
I could be getting things mixed up. I read an awful lot of material, so I could be, transposing things. And I apologize for interrupting, but it just seemed to hit my memory, and I wasn't sure, and I wanted to see if you could jog my memory a little bit is all.
Well, as it's understood in science, anyway, in any case, the notion that agricultural origins are of high altitude was originally put forward by Vavilov. I think the English translation of his article appeared in 1953, so he probably wrote it in the 30s or the 40s. He himself, he died during the Second World War as a prisoner of Stalin in a jail, wrongfully accused of crimes, and became a scapegoat for the atrocities that Stalin had committed in terms of famine in the 30s. Side story, but a horrible death to a very great man. He's another one of these scientists that I think as time goes by, more and more people will eventually come to recognize his importance. But today, most people have never heard of him. But he shows, and we show in our book, that the relationship between high altitude and the origins of agriculture is so direct. There, the areas that have the high altitude are exactly where the origins of the domesticated plants are, that became the ones that we are totally reliant upon in terms of civilization today. So that's one of the things that we do. Well, one of the more recent ones that happened is the origins of sugar and bananas.
Oh, really?
And yes, this has just not relatively recently been discovered that bananas and sugarcane was originally domesticated in New Guinea. Now, here's the interesting thing. New Guinea is a huge island. It's the third largest island in the world. You've got Antarctica, Greenland, and then New Guinea. New Guinea is a very large island, and it's a mountain. It's very mountainous. It's in the tropics, and it's very isolated. It wasn't until the 1930s that the Europeans even got into the interior, and it was only by using planes that they did so. So there's been people living in New Guinea for probably 40,000. They now estimate for 40,000 years. For 30,000 of those 40,000 years, they lived near the shore and did fishing and just ate the plants and animals that were around there. And then suddenly, at this 9,600 time period, they left the shore and went up about 1,500 meters, and they drained a swamp. They drained a swamp, and they planted bananas and sugarcane that had been at the shore level. And the question is, why were they doing that? And of course, the Earth crust displacement provides a theory for that, because what happened was New Guinea moved closer to the equator and became so warm that the plants and animals that were adapted to the sea level, it was getting too warm for them. The humans took those plants and animals up to the higher altitude and then rebooted them up there. And that's how we ultimately ended up getting bananas and sugar. It was they spread out from New Guinea. So it's just kind of an interesting story there. There's all sorts of things happening around this same time period. But I think that the thing when you talk about Atlantis, and I know there's a lot of people that just can't stand the word Atlantis. It immediately closes their mind. But
I don't understand people like that. I really don't.
Well, if you put it in a larger context, you can put it into a larger context of world mythology. Let's just say it's one of the stories in a big, giant jigsaw puzzle. It might be the central piece. But if you start to look at world mythology, if you take a look at, for example, in my province here, there's a group of people called the Okanagan. They're in British Columbia. They're also in Washington State. They have a story of an island that existed before the flood that was called Suma Tuiwula. And it was their homeland. And bear in mind, they don't live on an island. They're living in the interior in the Rocky Mountains, okay? So they're not like island people, but they claim that their homeland is island, and you find this again and again around the world. But just to stick with them for a second here, they say that there was suddenly a change in the sun of some sort, and a great flood came, forced them to leave their homeland, get into boats, and they were in this flood that lasted for a long period of time, and ultimately they came to the shores of what we call British Columbia, Washington State, and then they rapidly got away from the ocean and went up into the interior. Now, the interesting thing about this Sumi Tuiwula is this sound pattern. It's da-da-da-da-da-da, like na-na-na-na-na-na. Okay, so now let's go over to Japan. They have a story told in a book called Kojiki, which is the most ancient stories of Japan, of their original homeland, which was near the pole, which was formed when two gods spun the earth around and drops with a spear, and the droplets fell down onto the ocean and formed islands, which they called, it means islands of the congealed drops, and what they call it is Ono Goro Jima, dada dada dada. Okay, so you say coincidence. Two. Now go to India, among the Rig Veda, one of the oldest written records of humanity, and they have a story of Urry Anavajo, da da da. And Urry Anavajo is an island. It's destroyed in a flood, and then it's covered in snow and ice, and the people must flee in large boats and make their way across the ocean, and where they land on on top of a mountain. And this landing on top of a mountain is also part of the Suma Tuiwula story in the Okanagan. So what we're finding in world mythology, let's just say Plato had never written anything about Atlantis. If we didn't even know the word Atlantis, there would still be, in world mythology, the same story being told in Asia, in the Middle East, in North America, that there is an island, there was an island that was a homeland, that was there was a change in the sun or the sky, and then suddenly a great deluge. In some cases, the people are warned and they climb into boats. In other cases, they just scramble for boats and make it out. They're on the ocean for a long period of time, and then they land in these new lands. And so you have this story of what we call the Lost Island Paradise motif. It is since Plato couldn't have influenced any of these stories. The fact that Plato is saying the same story, and of course Plato claims that his story comes ultimately from Egypt. If it's an Egyptian story, as he claims, then it's just a part of a large pattern around the world of a story that has largely been forgotten and has, to an incredible degree, been discarded and discounted by scientific investigation. If, for example, you take a look at what archaeologists say about the peopling of America, what they say is this. They say, okay, there was people in Asia, and they were finding it was worthwhile to go into what's called Beringia, the land bridge between Alaska and Siberia. And then they were pioneers that came down through an ice-free corridor, or they took boats and went along the west coast. And it's all this sort of exploration pioneer idea, which is really just American history being imposed upon Native American mythology. Because when you look at when you look at what we call in Canada First Nations peoples' stories, what you find is not this idea of a pioneer going to a new land to have a new life, but rather a total and disastrous displacement from a paradise and being forced to, by climate and by physical events, to leave the place that they had lived, and then through what for them was almost a random experiencing, ending up in North America or South America. The same stories are told in South America. So it's not a story of pioneers and explorers. It's a story of climatic refugees, clinging to the high altitudes and avoiding the lowlands for fear of being struck by tsunamis and earthquakes. So the discrepancy between what archaeology and anthropology teaches in universities and what the people who have lived in North America for thousands of years say about their own past is so great that it's really quite shocking. And to me, I find it's disgraceful that the stories that are told by people like the Cherokee, the Utes of Utah, the Okanagan, the Kootenai, the Haida in British Columbia, all telling a similar story that is diametrically opposed to what archaeologists are saying. And you're not even told that if you're taking an archaeology course. If you take an archaeology class in university or something, you're not saying, nobody tells you that, oh, this is not what the people are saying. It's just straightforward, okay, we're going to tell you what's happening here. Here's the archaeological record, and this is what we're saying. And it's not in any way compared to what the people are saying. And what we do in Atlantis Beneath the Ice is we've turned that on its head. We believe that what the people said, their ancestors have told them, is true. That there was once a island paradise in the middle of the ocean that was destroyed 9,600 BC by what we think to be an earth crust displacement when what it seemed as though the sky was falling, because of course it's the crust shifting. Just to get a little bit of sense of what that phenomenon is like, if you're there at the time and it's happening, the sun, which we think is rising in the east all the time, suddenly it's not rising in the same spot because the crust is moving. So eventually you get a different sunrise location. We illustrate this from the place that I find one of the most fascinating areas of all. It's called Haida Gwaii. It's a couple of islands in Canada, but just to the immediate south of Alaska. From Haida Gwaii, on a clear day, you can see Alaska. So in Haida Gwaii, if you look for them, if they looked what today we call east, before the displacement, east was north. What is east of them is the Hudson Bay, and that at their time that's where the pole was. So they had a completely different experience with directions as a result of this displacement as well. So, and once we realized that the Earth's crust was over the Hudson Bay rather than the Arctic Circle, the Arctic Ocean as we call it today, then it makes sense that there's animals and plants living in Alaska and northern and northeastern Siberia and Beringia that are like very clearly temperate zone adapted animals like, deer and bison and mammoths, rhinoceroses, wild horses, lions, antelope. These are the things that were existing in Alaska and in Siberia and Beringia at the same time that Ohio, for instance, was under a mile of ice. And so people haven't really come to question, why is it that, Alaska is warmer than Ohio during an ice age? And the answer is, there isn't such a thing as an ice age. You're either in the polar zone or you're not in the polar zone. If you're in the Arctic Circle, you're in an ice age. And today, Alaska, Siberia, and Beringia, about half of it is in the Arctic Circle. So that's why those animals no longer exist there. So what this theory of Earth crust displacement does, apart from explaining Atlantis, it also explains why people could have lived in Siberia during an ice age. So I'll just stop there. Did you have another question you'd like?
Okay, well, yes, actually, I was going to mention the fact that I've allowed us to get 40 minutes into this show and have not yet mentioned your website at www.flem-ath.com, and that's FLEM-ATH.com. And also, you can find his book at Amazon, and I've got a link to go into it to Amazon right underneath the show description, right below the chat room here. And also, I don't want y'all to forget that the call-in number is 832-632-7904. Now, Rand, I was wanting to get back around to asking you some questions, though, as regard to one thing, the map of this. I mean, when you look at the picture of the map, that because I've seen the one I think you're talking about, it's a picture of Antarctica before any of the ice. Am I correct?
Oh yes, the Kirker map with the ice free. Yes.
Okay. Now on this map, can you tell that it's got like the rings of water around the individual islands, like was described by Plato?
Okay. Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing about that. Plato describes Atlantis as an island continent with a series of adjoining islands. So between Atlantis and some other land mass that he describes as the whole opposite continent, which is kind of that we'd have to get into that in another time. But there is a description. Plato's description does include this notion that between Atlantis and the closest isle, other parts of the world's continent, there were islands. And this is exactly what we find in Antarctica if you look at what the continent looks like without its ice.
Now, you got a picture of that in your book, don't you?
Yes, on page 121, yeah.
Great. That's something I'd like to see myself. I've seen a picture online, but, it's been like 4 or 5 years since I saw it. I get a lot of stuff on the internet, so you don't get to see all of it, frequently. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Would you like? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you: was there any possibility that the location that you believe to be Atlantis under the ice, that it could possibly be Thule or Arcana or one of the other missing continents that haven't been found yet, instead of being Atlantis itself?
The thing is, we haven't really discussed Plato's account of Atlantis, and I believe that Plato's account of Atlantis is an accurate, sophisticated, post-21st century, a most sophisticated description of the Earth's geography as seen from Antarctica. Now, we see the world from Europe's perspective. Europe they were the explorers. They changed. At one time, the Atlantic Ocean referred to a body of water that went around the world, all the way around the world. They decided, oh no, there's the North Atlantic, and now there's the South Atlantic. And then when Vasco da Gama got to on his way to India, he said, okay, now we've got an Indian Ocean. And when Magellan got to past South America, he says, okay, now we've got this peaceful ocean, the Pacific Ocean. So our modern concept of our own planet has been dictated to us by the Europeans' experience of exploration. It isn't really even scientific. It's historical. When you take a look at the planet scientifically, as oceanographers do, that's their job. Oceanographers say one thing. There is one ocean. There is only one ocean. All of them are interconnected. And you can see this most forcefully if you pick up a globe and spin it around and look at Antarctica and ask yourself, what ocean is this in? Europeans couldn't answer that. They have to say, oh, well, it's in the Pacific, it's in the Indian, and it's in the South Atlantic. But where's the boundary between the Pacific and the Indian and the South Atlantic? There is no boundary. It is one ocean. There was one ocean. And in Plato's account of the description of the location of Atlantis, Atlantis is said to be in the real ocean. And the real ocean is, in our view, what oceanographers say is the true reality, the scientific reality of our planet. We have one ocean, one continuous ocean around the world, of which the Mediterranean is but a small bay having a narrow entrance. And those are the words that are actually used in the description of the location of Atlantis, that the Mediterranean is but a small bay having a narrow entrance. So, to give you Plato, now, there's no way that Plato knew this. Plato was a philosopher in the 4th century BC. He doesn't know this. But what he does know is a story that came to him from his ancestor, Solon. And Solon was the Athenian lawgiver, the first person to, well, you might say he was the sort of George Washington of Athenian democracy. He basically was the first one to take power from the aristocrats and give it to people, men, not women, but there were votes. He created all these laws, and then when he finished all those laws, people kept bugging him about trying to interpret everything. So he said, "No, I'm not sticking around," and he left, and he went to Egypt. And while he was in Egypt, he met with the most learned of the Egyptian priests. Now, one of these priests, his name was Zonkus, is the person who told him the story of Atlantis. And what Plato is actually doing in his dialogues is reproducing what he heard Solon heard from this Zonkus. Now, you might think, oh, it's third hand. But you have to remember that in those days, people had incredible memories because there wasn't writing like there was today. In fact, Plato and Aristotle are really famous. Not mostly, but a good deal of their fame comes from the fact that they lived in an age when the oral tradition was turning into the written record, and they were the people who were doing the writing, and they were writing up everything, including everything that had happened before, 200 or 300 years in their own cultures. So they get a lot of the credits for what was happening. But the point being that their ability to reproduce words that had been spoken 200 years previously was not a big deal in those days, as it would be today when we live in a literate society where storing information in books and in the internet is the way to go. We don't store it in our memory. We don't have well-developed memories like they did in an oral tradition. So what Zonkus says to Solon says, first of all, Solon is trying to get this Egyptian priest to speak about the past, and he starts to brag that, oh, well, I know about the flood. and he starts to tell the story, the Greek story of the flood, and he's about to speak this, and when Zonkus interrupts him and says, "Oh, Solon, you Greeks are all children. There is no such thing as an old Greek. You know, and the reason is you have no idea how old things are and what has happened. But we, the Egyptians, we have records. We have records of people who lived 9,000 years ago. And I will tell you the story." So this is where the story of Atlantis emerges. It is a oral story told from Zonkus to Solon. Solon preserves it as an oral tradition and passes it on to his descendants, one of whom eventually, 200 years later, is Plato. And then Plato writes it down. So the story is ultimate and Plato does not claim that these are his ideas. He just is reproducing the things that Zonkus is saying. He doesn't even understand them, I don't think, because he talks about the real ocean. He talks about there being a continent that surrounds the real ocean. Now that sounds bizarre, and nobody's been able to figure that out unless you look at the world from Antarctica. And when you look at the world from Antarctica, and there's several maps in the book that does this for you, but probably the best one would be one called the Atlantean View on page 67. What it does is it shows this map that we've used, a U.S. naval map centered on Antarctica, and then we've taken that map and put it into what the ocean level was at that time, and then we've compared it to the words that Plato used. And Plato tells us that Atlantis was an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. Now, in his notion of Asia and Libya is not the same as ours, but it still makes Atlantis the size of the lower 48 states of the United States. Like, it's continental size. It's huge. And there was passage, and it says from it there was passages for the seafarers of those times to reach the other islands. Those are those other islands that we were just talking about on the Kirker map of Atlantis. And from them, the whole opposite continent. Because from this perspective, if you look at the world from the perspective of Antarctica, what we consider to be separate continents, North America, South America, Asia, Europe, Africa, all seem to be separate continents when you're looking from the north. But when you're looking from the south, they seem to merge into one that encircles the world ocean. And that description is given in Plato's account. And what we're saying is this is an accurate description of a real place at a real time. And this geography that he has given, which most people up until now has considered to be gibberish, they couldn't understand it, is actually, when it's properly decoded, is a true representation of the Earth's geography as seen from Antarctica, as it was 11,500 years ago. And if that's true, and if that is true, that means that they must have mapped the entire Earth. And if they've mapped the entire Earth, that means that they have at least the ability to determine longitude at sea, something that we weren't able to do until the 1770s. So their technology has to be at minimum 1770s technology. And I'm suggesting, and we are suggesting in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, that Atlantis was an advanced technological society, probably as advanced as we are today in a different way. And that when it was destroyed, it was utterly destroyed. However, the people who did survive were in boats. And some of them probably might have even been submarines. There's stories in the Haida that I was mentioning just south of Alaska, where they talk about people coming out of clams that were landed on the shore, and these clams were carried by birds, gigantic. And inside, when the clams opened up, the people came out. So you have this notion. You have to understand that how would you describe a submarine if you have no notion of technology? it would be a big whale, or in this case, it looked like a clam,
or a great fish,
or a great fish, anything. And then you get these thunderbirds as well, which are an ocean is common in the Pacific Northwest. We have these thunderbirds. I remember not too long ago, I was just walking my dogs, and we're near an airport, and normally it's just ordinary aircraft going in there, but this one day, one of these jet fighters was there, and it took off. And I thought, my God, that is a thunderbird. Because it is like thunder if you're close to one of these things taking off.
Oh, yeah, I used to be in the San Diego MCRD boot camp, and those airplanes would take off, and they would shake your whole dadgum parade deck.
No, it's just so. I think that what we're seeing in many of these, there would have been. I believe that there. Here's how I believe what happened. First of all, Atlantis was hit by tidal waves. Everybody had to leave. If you stayed on the island, you were doomed. You were dead. You had to get to boats. And once you're on boats, and then you have to get away from the shoreline. Otherwise, tidal waves will knock you right back in. So you're doing everything you can to get out to sea. And as you look back, from your perspective, if you're on the water looking back, a tsunami, it looks as though the island is sinking. Because if a tsunami, if you imagine a tsunami from a boat outside looking at an island, the tsunami hits the island. If you're in the boat, it looks as though the island is sinking. If you're on the island, it looks as though the ocean is rising. The story about Atlantis being sinking is really just the optical illusion of the people on the boats escaping. They're looking back at their homeland and they're thinking their island is sinking, because that's what they're seeing. It looks as though that the island is sinking. Now, the island didn't actually sink. It was just tidal waves that were hitting it. Those people who survived then some of them were in, I think, probably relatively sophisticated boats, and some of them could have been submarines. If we imagine if this happened today, you have nuclear submarines, you have some big ships that might survive these kind of tidal waves. And they might even, and when everything's settled down, they might still go for, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. But eventually, you're going to have to abandon those ships, because you're not going to have the civilization, the infrastructure there to create the parts that are missing. Eventually, you have to abandon those ships. And when you leave, the one thing that you take that is very valuable is maps of the Earth. And that's where the maps of the ancient sea kings of Charles Hapgood's book comes into play. The maps were valuable and retained their value long after the ships that they were originally housed in were long gone. So people kept those maps and they reproduced them. And we have some of those maps, and that's the thing that's so interesting. Like the Peary Reese map, showing the subglacial features of Antarctica. That's not possible according to archaeology or even modern present-day science. It's just not possible. However, it not only did Charles Hapgood took these maps and he said, "Look, this looks like subglacial Antarctica to us." And he took them to the cartographic department of the U.S. Air Force and said, "You take a look at these and whatever you find out, tell us." And then they came back and they said, "These maps are accurate depictions of Antarctica below the ice. We have no idea how that was done, but they are accurate." So the only way that they could have been done is if there's two ways.
Before the plate moved.
Yes, before the Earth's crust shifted, that part of Antarctica was not in the polar zone. It was in the temperate zone. People lived there, and they died there, and some of them fled from there. And as they fled, they took with them three things which really ultimately were important to our civilization. One was the knowledge of agriculture and how to reboot it. Two was an incredible knowledge of astronomy, because to be a navigator on the seas as the Atlanteans were, you had to know astronomy. And three was these maps of the Earth. Now, the maps of the Earth didn't, they showed the Earth as it was before the displacement. So the maps would show, for example, maps of North America would not show the Hudson Bay because it was under ice. But at the same time, they would show this land bridge that connected the Beringia, that connected Alaska to Siberia. So we have ancient maps dating before the time of European exploration that depict North America, for example, as being covered in ice and having this land bridge to Asia. And it wasn't even, the whole notion of the land bridge is a post-Second World War confirmation. When they found the Bering Strait, when the explorer Bering discovered the Bering Strait, then people started to think, it was possible for people to have come to North America from Asia across this relatively, narrow strait. Then, it's really since the Second World War that the exploration of this land bridge called Beringia was being explored. But yet, we have ancient maps. The Haji Hamid map is what the one I'm referring to, that shows the continent of North America in an amazingly detail, long before Europeans were capable of even mapping their own continents, let alone the continents that they were exploring. So there's a level of technology in these ancient maps that imply that there was technology in the past that was lost and then has only been reinvented. And that is the ability to determine longitude at sea. It's a long. You need very, very accurate marine clocks. They're called marine chronometers to be able to determine where you are east and west of Greenwich. Incidentally, and this is in the other book that I wrote with Colin Wilson, Atlantis Blueprint, we show that it was a mistake to have made Greenwich the zero. That what should have really been adopted as zero was the Great Pyramid.
Because that makes sense because it's the center of the Earth.
That is the center of the Earth. And what we show there, and this is interesting, is that if you go at, let's say, if you make Greenwich, if you make Giza zero, we call it the Giza prime meridian, then you'd say, let's go a third of the way around the world, 120 degrees, for example. And that hits right through about 4 pyramids in Mexico and Central America. Copan, Chichen Itza, Lubantum, another one I forget the name of. But it's like a line, and it's exactly 1/3 of the distance around the Earth from Giza, and Giza, don't forget, is 1/3 of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. And now you have got pyramids in the New World that are aligned with pyramids in the Old World. Okay, 120. Let's go to 130. 130, you've got Teotihuacan, the Temple of the Sun, the biggest pyramid in Mexico, one of the biggest pyramids in Mexico. At 140, you've got Easter Island. Let's go back. 110, you've got Quito, the capital of the northern capital of the Inca Empire on the equator. and then go to 100, you've got Tiwanaku in Lake Titicaca pyramids. So you've got civilizations in the New World that are at 10-degree intervals from if we had adopted Giza as 0, then these were all at 100, 110, 120, 130, 140, just like that. So it seems as though even the location of the sacred sites in the New World were linked in some ways to the sacred sites in the Old World, and so that means that there's something that was happening on a global level, and we believe that there was an attempt to try to lay down these foundations, and they were probably related to recalibrating the maps, because the maps were no longer accurate. If you suddenly move the crust of the Earth so that no longer is North America in the polar zone but is in the temperate zone, then the maps that you used to have about North America are no longer relevant. Hey, you've got places that were like when we take a look at maps of Antarctica today, even almost 99% of all the maps you look at of Antarctica today, it's the ice-covered Antarctica that you see. You don't see the actual configuration of the continent. You see the ice as if it's included. And these maps that had existed for the Atlanteans prior to that had the same thing about North America. It's interesting. Like North America is in many ways the Atlantis of today. It's the one that has risen up as Atlantis has fallen. And incidentally, if there is ever another Earth's thrust displacement, and I'm not saying that there will be one soon, I don't think there will be one soon, but if there is, when there is one, because it's not a question of if, but it's a question of when, whatever happens, Antarctica will come out of the polar zone. And that means that once again, Antarctica will be an island continent, a temperate island continent in the middle of the ocean. And that continent, its trading advantage, being in the center of the world ocean, is so great that will be the great nation of the next era. So the notion that Atlantis might rise again is certainly true. It may be thousands of years from now, though.
Okay. Now, also, Rand, I wanted to mention that earlier Jen from the chat room had asked a couple of questions that I thought I'd try to get in here real quick like.
Okay.
She's a real big Hollow Earth fan, so these questions, or at least one of them, is referring to the Hollow Earth theory. She said something about the Hollow Earth excluding myths and facts of being in the Earth. She wants to know, is there such a place? And I don't know if you're familiar with the Hollow Earth theory to be able to answer that, but I guess we can ask you and see.
I certainly have heard of that. I don't believe that's credible, I'm afraid. I don't know where that came from. I think that there is certainly, let's put it this way, on the positive side on that, there is a lot of information and there's a lot of physical evidence that being underground was important to people in the ancient world. There seems to be quite a series of tunnels in South America, and also in Turkey there's these massive constructions that are underground. Even Göbekli Tepe that I was mentioning at one point was covered was artificially covered in soil, and that would have created cave-like things. But the idea of the whole Earth itself being hollow, I don't find that credible. But the idea of underground world, yes, that certainly seems to be some evidence of that.
Okay, now we got a couple more questions. We just had one more pop up in chat, but it looks like she had one more, and you probably already answered this one, but I'm going to go ahead and read it off in case I'm missing something here. And she wants to know if it's possible that it may have been part of Earth or still is. And of course, if you don't think that it ever really existed, then it couldn't still be a part of the Earth.
You mean the hollow Earth?
Yeah.
No, I don't agree with that. I'm afraid I can't. I don't find that credible. I'm afraid.
That's all. Well, I mean, everybody's got their own, theories.
I'm not claiming to be an expert about that. I wouldn't say that I've explored it and know it that well, but it doesn't seem credible to me just on first value. But you know,
at least not on the face value. If you dug deeper, it might be different.
Who knows? Or it might mean something slightly different than what people are imagining.
Oh yeah, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, now Leslie was wanting to know: does it concern you that there's not a single physical artifact that's identified as coming from Atlantis?
Not at all. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the oldest civilization that we know. That's the Sumerians, and we're talking the earliest stages would be around 4000 BC. That's 6,000 years ago. Okay. Atlantis was destroyed 11,500 years ago. It's twice as old. So the forces of nature have had their toll upon Atlantis for twice as long as we know a civilization has existed. So, sure, there's going to be things ground down. I do think that Plato's description of Atlantis and its location and its geography of the world is an artifact in a sense. It is an accurate description of a real place at a real time and its destruction by a real event. So in that sense, there's an artifact in that sense. But actual artifacts, those may yet be discovered in Antarctica. You also have to look into the fact that at tops, there's 5,000 people in Antarctica any given time. And they're almost all in 3 or 4 or 5 bases. And none of those bases are in the areas that we think are of importance in terms of where Atlantis had been. They're at the pole. They're on the other side of the part of Antarctica which we think was in ice even during Atlantis. So the activity in Antarctica generates around the ice sheets, not around the continental areas. There's more. The area that we're most interested in is contested by Chile, Argentina, and the UK. So if you're going in there to do things, you're taking your life into your hands. So there's nobody looking for any artifacts in Antarctica, and that's got to be the number one reason that none were found. Second, even if they were looking, they're not looking in the right place. Third, if they were looking in the right place, there's still incredible forces of nature here that have ground things down. Now, even given all that, I still think that it's possible that in some of these areas of what we call Lesser Antarctica, the area towards South America, which don't have as much snowfall as that have others, some of the islands in that area, those areas wouldn't have been covered in so much ice. So it's possible that something could be discovered there. Again, they're not looking. Nobody's looking. So if you're not looking, you're not finding. And if you haven't found because you haven't looked, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Okay. And also, we got one by Mayread, and I may be pronouncing that wrong. It was either Mayred or Mayread, as I understand it. But she wants to know, what about Edgar Casey's predictions of the records of Atlantis being under the foot of the Sphinx?
I don't really put much credence in Edgar Casey, I have to say. Not to say that he hasn't done some things that might have been unexpected, but As far as Atlantis, I've read what he's written about Atlantis, and I don't think he's very well informed about Atlantis. I don't think that he really understands what was being said about Atlantis in Plato's account. So as far as Atlantis is concerned, and I'm not saying anything else about what Edgar Cayce has said, but as far as Atlantis is concerned, I just don't think he's very well informed about Atlantis at all. So I would say, no, I don't think that he knew what he was talking about when he was talking about Atlantis. It just doesn't jive with what Plato says. And bear in mind that if Plato hadn't written his things down, we wouldn't be talking about Atlantis right now, because everything that is known about Atlantis is all 100% comes from Plato, except for these maps. Other than that, but everything about Atlantis that we know comes from Plato, and I don't think that Edgar Cayce's understanding of Plato is very good at all.
Okay. Now, when I was listening to you a minute ago, because you were talking about the Earth crust displacement and how it moved whole continents, the thought occurred to me that there was also a time that Egypt was tropical, and as I understand it, the ice age that you referred to was about the time that it became a desert wasteland. I'm assuming that might have been also connected to the Earth's displacement, and I was wondering if you probably thought the same thing.
Certainly. Charles Hapgood was interested in the changes that were happening in the in North Africa as a result of the last Earth crust displacement. These things are happening over periods of thousands of years. It's very gradual that as the Earth sort of readjusts itself, once the displacement has occurred, there's a long period of the ice sheets melting off, and the ocean level changes. And when you get different ocean levels, you get different ocean currents. When you get different ocean currents, you get different wind patterns. When you get different wind patterns, you get different rainfall patterns. So I think it's true to say that North Africa was a much more favorable place for the first 6,000 years after the displacement than it was for the second 6,000 years since then. And so what we see here is that between 11,500 years ago until about 6,000 years ago, North Africa was probably a very nice place to be. Very good. All of it wasn't a desert like it is today. Then it just got warmer and drier, and that just continued on right up to the present day. It's still getting drier. Even the suffering in Sudan and a lot of these places in Africa, Ethiopia is a direct result of the drying up of the Sahara. And there is a relationship in the sense that the climate does get drier, has got drier in North Africa.
Okay. Now, Jen has also wanted to ask another question while you're answering that.
Sure.
And she said to ask you, why is all the governments fighting over Antarctica just like Hitler was trying to claim it as his own?
Okay, well, those are the Nazis had a particular fondness for polar areas in their mythological notion of their origins, and they were primarily concerned with the Arctic, but they also had bases in Antarctica as well. So there was certainly a Nazi obsession with Antarctica and the polar zones in general because it fit into their racial myths about their origins. So it's true to say that the Nazis were interested in and may have had and certainly did take an interest in Antarctica. As far as to what's happening today, the answer is we just don't know. We don't know what's going on down there. We know that, of course, that there is this base at the South Pole. and that's an American base. We know that there's Russian bases, and there's Argentina's into it. But, basically, there's nobody down there monitoring what's going on from, like, the press, for example. So we really don't know what's going on down there. So the answer to what's going down there, what's going on down there, is I simply don't know.
Okay. I was just telling Jennifer in the chat room, the one that asked this, that Nick Redfern might have been a better person to ask this, because he's got a book coming out that's going to cover some of this stuff she was asking within the next year, and he'll probably be back on my show to tell us about that then, which is a ways down the road. But because of the title of the book, I'm thinking he may be a little bit, more familiar. And we talking about being familiar or not familiar. I'm going to go out in murky water here and ask you something that I'm not 100% sure if you're familiar or to what degree you're familiar with this. But, you got the Bermuda Triangle and the Dragon's Triangle. And there's a guy that has a whole, wrote an article or an essay about this here called the 10 Valve Vortices Around the World, that show places that are lined up much like the, along the equator, for example, that are like the Bermuda Triangle and the Dragon's Triangle that have all these phenomena going on. And he had pyramids lined up at each, place where one was located exactly. And I was thinking that perhaps with what we talked about with the Earth displacement, that maybe there was once some form of an energy grid that these pyramids were used for, that when the Earth got displaced, the crust did, the pyramids got moved, that may have, kind of like short-circuited the network field, because I know that you can get some kind of energy from certain stones that I've heard about that they use to build pyramids, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if I'm just, wondering aimlessly on that there thought line, or if you think I might have something going.
Well, there might be something to that. I mean, there is a fellow named Christopher Dunn, D-U-N-N. You might want to get in touch with him. He's the person who could tell you about that. He's the person
I've had him on my show before. He's a very nice guy, but I never thought to ask him about this. I can always ask him back.
Yeah, I think he probably would be more informed on that than I would be. He studied pyramids and what they might be used for, and energy and stuff like that. I just haven't done that research. So he's so far ahead in that. That's something that he's done. I think he's the person to talk to about that.
Okay. Well, listen, we've been on for about an hour and almost a half now, and you and me didn't discuss prior how long you wanted the show to last, and I was going to ask you earlier, but we had such a good conversation going, and people were asking questions, and it just didn't seem like a good time to interrupt, you know what I mean?
No problem.
So I was going to say, since we got to get dinner going on our end, I don't know if you got something going on or not.
Yeah, my wife just is returning with the dogs.
Okay. I was going to say, real quick, do you have any last-minute thoughts you'd like to share with my listeners?
I would just like to say to the people of Texas, thank you so much. Texas is my best-selling state for all of our books. The people in Texas seem to be independent thinkers. They don't let other people tell them how to think, and they use their own mind, and I really appreciate that. And without that kind of reader, if you put the word Atlantis in your title, you're dead in the water before you even start. But people in Texas are more open-minded about this than any other part of North America. Our sales in Texas are always better than anywhere else.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I'm a Texan.
Well, my mother's maiden name was Houston, so and my grandfather was ultimately from America as well.
Okay. Well, also we just had another question go to the chat room. Leslie wants to know if you're familiar with the work of Thompson and Cremo. Michael Cremo and his partner Thompson.
Yes, I certainly am. Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
He's another one I've had on my show. They've done some really great work, because he commented earlier that they had found Oopart according to their book, all over the world, in other words, but I don't know if any of it was could be considered, verified artifacts from Atlantis, in other words.
Yeah, I've read his books, Forbidden Archaeology.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating stuff. How it all fits together. We're at the very early stages of this whole investigation, and I think that lots is yet to come. And I think that there are people right now who are in their teens and in their 20s who, 30 years from now will be doing some incredible things on these fields. So, this is a really early days about this whole alternative history phenomena. And so, people like Cremo and Christopher Dunn and John Anthony West is another person, and they have done a lot of things that are making people think that what we're taught in schools and what we're taught in the universities is not the whole story. And so it's good to have people that have questioning minds, and so this is going to happen. It's going to change. Everything is going to change over the next 20, 30 years, I think.
Okay.
Whole history.
I certainly hope it is going to change, because I get tired of people with closed minds, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah, we had the debate whether we wanted to put Atlantis in the title, and we just decided, well, no, we're going to go with it, because that's what we know to be the most likely closest to the truth as we can get to. So we're not afraid or embarrassed by the word Atlantis. We're proud to be associated with it, and I think in time will tell that that's the right decision to take.
Okay. Well, on a closing note, I would like to invite you back to my show again in the future. You're a fantastic guest, and, I really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, that'd be great. I'd love to.
All righty. I got your information. We can always stay in touch. I think you got my email. I know we had a little missed email there, but I mean, technology's not perfect.
Yeah, well, we'll sort it out.
Okay, well, then in that case, I'm going to let you get to your dogs while I get to cooking supper. And I want to thank you very much. You have a great day.
Well, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, everybody, I want to thank y'all for coming and attending the show. I'd like to remind y'all to pay my friends a visit at UnitedParanormalInternational.ning, at SupernaturalUFO.com, and AlienandUFOCommunity.ning. If you click on the friends link on your left in my navigation menu, you'll go to a page that has banners on it for each one of those sites. I also want to encourage y'all to pass this link around to this show. Tell everybody about it. If you enjoyed the show, somebody else is likely to enjoy it as well. We got some really interesting shows coming up in the near future that people might be interested in. We got extraplanetary, well, I need to get that document open again, folks. Extraplanetary Experiences with Tom Stretcher, or Stryker, however you pronounce that, this coming Tuesday. And then we're going to have The Silent Gospel with James Barrett on March 24th. Synchronicity with Kirby Surprise on March 27th. And then we're going to have William Burns of UFO Hunters coming on Saturday the 31st. So we got a nice little lineup. Actually, I'm lined up into June, but I'm not going to go down the whole list right now and take up everybody's whole Saturday afternoon. But I just wanted to let you guys know that, they've got plenty of things coming up. Please invite your friends and share everything. And I'm going to call it quits for the show right there, and y'all have a good day.
In Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada. And prior to this time, before 9600 BC, the part of the pole that was at the part of the crust that was at the pole was in the Hudson Bay. So with these Earth crust displacements, you get incredible climatic change. The other thing that was happening at this time, and this has happened in the past decade, is something that's really quite remarkable, and that is in a place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
I've heard of that place.
Yes. Well, it is the most astonishing archaeological discovery that we've ever made, as far as I'm concerned. It dates exactly to 9,500 to 9,600 BC. It's exactly dates to the time, the very century that Plato says Atlantis is destroyed. And this is the time when the ocean level is rising, massive extinctions in North America, South America, Siberia, the beginnings of agriculture around the world. All these things are happening at the same time. And what we have at the Göbekli Tepe is suddenly, and previously to this, there's just hunters and gatherers going on for thousands of years. And then suddenly and abruptly, we have these 16-ton, 18 feet high limestone pillars being placed in circular formations after having been dragged for a third of a mile up a hill, and put into place as if it was a very simple thing to do. Now, when the current site is being almost completely controlled by the German Archaeological Institute, and they have concluded that to be able to move just one of these, would require at least 500 people. Now, as far as archaeology and anthropology is concerned, there wasn't populations of 500 people at that time. Everybody was living by hunting and gatherings. You might get up to most populations were 30, 40, 50 people. You might get up to 200 or 300. But suddenly we have what's called monumental architecture appearing with nothing before it. Map of Atlantis looks just like this 1970 map of Antarctica without the ice. So that was the thing that got me started. And after I had looked into that, I read the maps of the ancient sea kings, and I discovered that there was maps that showed South America and Antarctica long before Europeans were even capable of mapping continents. So there was a particular map, the Piri-Reis map of 1513, and it shows the eastern shore of South America, and then it shows on the bottom the subglacial features of parts of Antarctica. So now that was, that means that what it was like underneath the ice. So that got me thinking, well, what's going on here? So I went back to the maps of the ancient sea kings, and I was looking at that, and I noticed that this Charles Hapgood fellow had also written another book called The Earth's Shifting Crust. So I got a hold of that and looked into it, and then it started to click together to me. I started to see that there was something here that was worthwhile investigating, and I came to the conviction that there was Atlantis had been a real place and had been destroyed by a real event, and was still discoverable. Once I got onto that, then I started to delve into this whole theory of Earth crust displacement, which I probably should just give a little bit of an explanation of that.
Okay.
We all know plate tectonics is the Earth is made up of a series of plates that are very gradually moving in relationship to each other. And this is sort of similar, except that in this case, we're talking about all the plates as a single unit, as the outer shell. If you took an orange peel off an orange and then it reattached it, the orange peel itself is like the crust. And what Charles Hapgood proposed was that the Earth's crust periodically is displaced over the interior. And when that happens, there's incredible climatic changes because you can go and I'll get that.
Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Rand Flem-Ath. And we're going to talk about his belief, and he's got a book on this too, by the way, that Atlantis is beneath the Antarctic ice. And this is a theory that I've read from time to time before in the past. And I'll be honest with you, being a radio show host for 5 years now, I've interviewed guests that's had thoughts that it was by Bimini and India and Santorini and under the ice here at the Arctic Circle. And I really find listening to all these theories very, very interesting because I know from what I've also read, guys, that Atlantis wasn't the only sunken continent. So if one person is mistaken about what continent is under that ice, as long as he knows there's a continent there, it could be one of the other lost ones. And then that's always interesting information to have. So I'm going to introduce Rand here and give him a chance to tell you what got him started looking for this at the Antarctic ice there. So, Rand, how are you doing today?
Very good. Yeah. How I got started into Atlantis. I'm a librarian by profession, and I was working in the library, and I came across a book about Atlantis. And I was just looking through it, and then there was a map in it. And I said, I'd never seen a map of Atlantis before, so I took a look at that. And then, a week or two later, another book came in and across the counter there. It was called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. It was written by Charles Hapgood. And, it was kind of interesting because it's all about ancient maps and how some of them are far more accurate than they should be. And, anyway, I was looking through it, and in it showed a map of Antarctica without the ice. And immediately, that picture of Atlantis came back, and I started to, I looked at them and I started to compare them, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is 1665. We find these stories of a civilization that existed before the flood, and most often they refer to it as an island. I can give you some of those stories, but just to get back to where we were beginning here.
Okay.
When I realized that the big ice sheet that on North America was then melting. That looked as if the North American continent had shifted, as well as the whole continent. It's the entire shell that's moving, and the continent just happens to be one of the passengers, if you like, as are the ocean basins. And what happened in North America was suddenly, having been in a polar zone, North America went into a temperate zone, and all those ice sheets. Those vast mountains of ice began to rapidly melt. The remnants are the Great Lakes, and in the process of melting, this is what the worldwide flood was. In addition, of course, as the crust shifted, there was massive earthquakes and floods. All of this is happening at around 9,600 BC, and this is precisely the time that the original account of Plato gives us for the destruction of this island continent of Atlantis. The story itself originates in the works of Plato. Plato wrote two dialogues, Tunisius and Cretius, both of which dealt with Atlantis in part. And in his account, he pinpoints the time as being 9,000 years before his ancestor Solon received the story. and his ancestor Solon lived around 600 BC. So it's 9,600 BC. So without any radiocarbon dating, without any anything to do with science, Plato's account pinpoints the exact time that geologists now say was the end of the Ice Age. Now, in the theory of Earth crust displacement, there really isn't ever an end to ice ages. Ice ages are simply those parts of the crust that are in the polar zone. So right now, there's an ice age can be in an area, say, in a temperate area, and end up in a polar zone. Or you can be in a polar zone and end up in a temperate zone. And when I started to look into this, I looked because he had estimated this happened about 12,000 years ago. And of course, the story of Atlantis takes place. The destruction of Atlantis is supposed to have been taken place at 9,600 BC. So when I looked at that time period, we start to see that this is what geologists regard as the end of the Ice Age. Suddenly, everything's North America, which had been under a blanket of ice. It was there was an ice sheet on the eastern half of North America that is as big as the ice sheet that's on Antarctica today, and there was another ice sheet on the western side, the northwestern side of North America, that is as big as the ice cap that's on Greenland today. So with all that ice on North America, the ocean levels are lower, much lower, nearly 100 meters lower than they are today. And so there was a lot more land around the world, all the continental shelf.
That'd be about the time of Noah's flood, wouldn't it?
Pardon?
Wouldn't that be close to the time of Noah's flood as well?
Well, this is the flood. Yeah, we are talking about the flood. And the thing about Noah's flood that's interesting is that the story of Noah's flood presupposes a civilization existing before the flood. Otherwise, you wouldn't be getting the blueprints for making an ark that includes, units of measurements and how to construct it. And hunters and gatherers aren't building these big ships like this. There was a civilization, in the Bible, it's corrupt and wicked and is deserving of dying, and only this one man and his family survives. But the point there is that in the story of Noah, there is a civilization before the flood. And this is the thing that we start to find when we look around, because what I did at this point is I then started to look at world mythology. I started to look at the story of the flood. And again and again, throughout the world, in North American native mythology, all the way around the world, in South American native mythology, in Asia, Africa,